Airborne forces are ground combat units carried by aircraft and airdropped into battle zones, typically by parachute drop or air assault. Parachute-qualified infantry soldiers serving in airborne force are also known as paratroopers. The main advantage of airborne forces is their ability to be deployed into combat zones without land passage, as long as the airspace is accessible. Formations of airborne forces are limited only by the number and size of air transport aircraft. A sizable force can appear out of the sky behind enemy lines in merely hours if not minutes, an action known as vertical envelopment. Airborne forces typically lack enough supplies for prolonged combat, so they are utilized for establishing an airhead to bring in larger forces, before carrying out other combat objectives. Some infantry fighting vehicles have also been modified for paratrooping with infantry to provide some heavier firepower. Due to their necessary slow descent, paratroopers are vulnerable to anti-air fire from ground defenders. The combat jumps are at low altitude, 400–500 feet, and normally carried out a short distance away, or directly on if lightly defended, from the target area at night. Airborne operations are also particularly sensitive to weather conditions, which can be dangerous to both the paratroopers and airlifters, so extensive planning is critical to the success of an airborne operation. Advances in VTOL technologies since World War II have brought increased flexibility, and air assaults have largely been chosen as the preferred method of insertion for recent conflicts. But airborne insertion is still maintained as a rapid response capability to get troops on the ground anywhere in the world within hours for a variety of missions. Although Winston Churchill proposed the creation of an airborne force to assault behind the German lines in 1917 during the First World War, the first modern operation was envisioned in late 1918. Major Lewis H. Brereton and his superior Brigadier General Billy Mitchell suggested dropping elements of the U.S. 1st Division behind German lines near Metz. The operation was planned for February 1919, but the war ended before the attack could be seriously planned. Mitchell conceived that U.S. troops could be rapidly trained to utilize parachutes and drop from converted bombers to land behind Metz in synchronization with the planned infantry offensive. Following the war, the United States Army Air Service experimented with the concept of carrying troops on the wings of aircraft, with them pulled off by the opening of their parachutes. The first true paratroop drop was by Italy in November 1927. Within a few years, several battalions were raised and eventually formed into two Folger and Nembo divisions. Although they later fought with distinction in World War II, they were never used in a parachute drop. Men drawn from the Italian parachute forces were dropped in a special forces operation in North Africa in 1943, in an attempt to destroy parked aircraft of the United States Army Air Forces. In Peru on March 27, 1927, Enrique Tavernier and Teledor leaped from a height of 2,000 meters, 6,600 feet, out of an Avro aircraft piloted by Captain Clifford, making Teledor the first Peruvian paratrooper. On May 10, 1928, Second Lieutenant Cesar Alvarez jumped from a height of 3,000 meters, 9,800 feet, becoming the first military parachutist. At about the same time, the Soviet Union was also experimenting with the idea, planning to drop entire units complete with vehicles and light tanks. To help train enough experienced jumpers, parachute clubs were organized with the aim of transferring into the armed forces if needed. Planning progressed to the point that corps-sized drops were demonstrated to foreign observers, including the British military attaché Archibald Wavell, in the Kiev military district maneuvers of 1935. One of the observing parties, Nazi Germany, was particularly interested. In 1936, Major F.W. Immons was ordered to set up a parachute school at Stendal, and was allocated a number of Junkers Ju-52 aircraft to train on. The military had already purchased large numbers of Junkers Ju-52s, which were slightly modified for use as paratroop transports, in addition to their other duties. The first during the invasions of Norway and Denmark in Operation Weserübung, the Luftwaffe dropped paratroopers on several locations. In Denmark, a small unit dropped on the Misnedefjord on the small island of Misnedo, to seize the Storström bridge linking the islands of Falster and Sealand. A paratroop detachment also dropped at the airfield of Aalborg, which was crucial for the Luftwaffe for operations over Norway. In Norway, a company of paratroopers dropped at Oslo's undefended airstrip. Over the course of the morning and early afternoon of April 9, 1940, the Germans flew insufficient reinforcements to move into the capital in the afternoon, but by that time the Norwegian government had fled. In the Battle of France, members of the Brandenburg Regiment landed by Fieseler 156 Torchlight reconnaissance planes on the bridges immediately to the south of the 10th Panzer Division's route of march through the southern Ardennes. In Belgium, a small group of German glider-borne troops landed on top of the Belgian fortress of Eben Emmel on the morning of May 10, 1940, and disabled the majority of its artillery. The fort held on for another day before surrendering. This opened up Belgium to attack by German Army Group B. The Dutch were exposed to the first large-scale airborne attack in history. During the invasion of the Netherlands, the Germans threw into battle almost their entire Luftlandekorps, an airborne assault army corps that consisted of one parachute division and one division of air landing troops plus the necessary transport capacity. The existence of this formation had been carefully kept secret until then. Two simultaneous airborne operations were launched. German paratroopers landed at 3 airfields near The Hague, hoping to seize the Dutch government. From one of these airfields, they were driven out after the first wave of reinforcements, brought in by Ju-52s, was annihilated by anti-aircraft fire, and fierce resistance by some remaining Dutch defenders. As a result, numerous crashed and burning aircraft blocked the runway, preventing further reinforcements from landing. This was one of the few occasions where an airfield captured by paratroops has been recaptured. The other 2 airfields were recaptured as well. Simultaneously, the Germans dropped small packets of paratroopers to seize the crucial bridges that led directly across the Netherlands and into the heart of the country. They opened the way for the 9th Panzer Division. Within a day, the Dutch position became hopeless. Nevertheless, Dutch forces inflicted high losses on German transportation aircraft. Moreover, 1,200 German elite troops from the Luftlandkorps taken prisoner around The Hague were shipped to England just before the capitulation of the Dutch armed forces. The Fallschirmjäger's greatest victory and greatest losses occurred during the Battle of Crete. Signals intelligence, in the form of Ultra, enabled the British to wait on each German drop zone, yet despite compromised secrecy, surviving German paratroops and air-landed mountain troops pushed the Commonwealth forces off the island in part by unexpected fire support from their light 75mm guns, though seaborne reinforcements were destroyed by the Royal Navy. However, the losses were so great that Adolf Hitler forbade their use in such operations in the future. He felt that the main strength of the paratroopers was a novelty, and now that the British had clearly figured out how to defend against them, there was no real point in using them anymore. One notable exception was the use. On September 12, 1943, Otto Skorzeny led a daring glider-based assault on the Grand Sasso Hotel, high in the Apennines Mountains, and rescued Benito Mussolini from house arrest, with very few shots being fired. On May 25, 1944, paratroopers were dropped as part of a failed attempt to capture Josip Broz Tito, the head of the Yugoslav partisans and later post-war leader of Yugoslavia. Ironically, the battle that ended Germany's paratrooper operations had the opposite effect on the Allies. Convinced of the effectiveness of airborne assaults after Crete, the Allies hurried to train and to organize their own airborne units. The British established 0.1 parachute training school at RAF Fringway near Manchester, which trained all 60,000 European paratroopers recruited by the Allies during World War II. An air landing school was also set up in New Delhi, India, in October-November 1941, at the then Wellington Airport, now the defunct Safdarjung Airport, to train paratroopers for the British Indian Army, which had been authorized to raise an airborne-capable formation earlier, resulting in the formation of the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade. The Indian Airborne Forces expanded during the war to the point that an airborne corps was planned bringing together the 2nd Indian Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division, but the war ended before it could materialize. A fundamental decision was whether to create small airborne units to be used in specific coup de main type operations, or to organize entire airborne divisions for larger operations. Many of the early, successful airborne operations were small, carried out by a few units, such as seizing a bridge. After seeing the success of other units and observing smokejumper training methods on how training can be done, in June 1940, General William C. Lee of the U.S. Army went on to establish the Army's 1st Airborne Division. The 101st World is reorganized into the 101st Airborne Division. The Allies eventually formed 2 British and 5 American divisions. The British 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions, and the U.S. 11th, 13th, 17th, 82nd, and 101st Airborne Divisions. By 1944, the British divisions were grouped into the 1st Airborne Corps under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Browning, while the American divisions in the European theater, the 17th, 82nd, and 101st, were organized into the XVII Airborne Corps under Major General Matthew Ridgway. Both corps fell under the 1st Allied Airborne Army under U.S. Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton. The first U.S. airborne operation was by the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion in November 1942, as part of Operation Torch in North Africa. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions saw the most active in the European theater, with the former in Sicily and Italy in 1943, and both in Normandy and the Netherlands in 1944. The 517th Parachute Regimental Combat Team was the principal force in Operation Dragoon in southern France. The 17th Airborne Division deployed to England in 1944, but did not see combat until the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945 when they, along with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, were deployed as ground troops. The U.S. 11th and 13th Airborne Divisions were held in reserve in the United States until 1944, when the 11th Airborne Division was deployed to the Pacific, but mostly used as ground troops, or for smaller airborne operations. The 13th Airborne